The question of Jesus' race and physical appearance has long been a topic of both historical and theological debate. While much of the world is accustomed to seeing images of Jesus with European features, particularly in Western art and culture, the reality of Jesus' physicality is quite different. To understand this, we must examine the historical and cultural context in which Jesus lived, as well as how African communities, both on the continent and in the diaspora, have reinterpreted his image through the lens of their own experiences. Jesus of Nazareth, a figure central to Christianity, was born in Bethlehem, which at the time was part of the Roman province of Judea in what is now Israel and Palestine. He lived during the 1st century CE, time when the Middle East was a melting pot of various ethnicities and cultures, but the region was predominantly inhabited by people of Semitic descent. Jesus, being a Jew, would have likely shared the typical physical features of the people in that region: darker skin, dark eyes, and dark hair. Historical evidence, including the writings of early Christian theologians and archaeologists, suggests that Jesus' physical features were far removed from the pale-skinned, light-eyed images commonly seen in Western depictions of him. However, the African perspective on Jesus' race has been shaped by more than just historical facts. The legacy of colonialism, slavery, and the African diaspora has deeply influenced how many African communities viewed Jesus' identity. The forced migration of millions of Africans to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade, coupled with the spread of Christianity, left a lasting imprint on African religious thought. In many ways, the introduction of Christianity to Africa was not just a spiritual conquest, but also a cultural one, where the European depictions of Jesus became the dominant image. For many Africans, these Western portrayals of Jesus as white seem to imply that divinity and holiness were tied to European features, something that was at odds with their own lived experiences of oppression, displacement, and marginalization. As African communities began to reclaim their identities during the colonial and post-colonial periods, a re-examination of Jesus' image and identity took place. African theologians and religious leaders began to challenge the dominant Western narratives surrounding Jesus. The African belief was that Jesus, as a divine figure, should not be confined to a single race or ethnicity. Rather, he transcended racial boundaries, and his message of salvation, liberation, and justice was meant for all people, regardless of their background. For many African Christians, Jesus' story of suffering and redemption spoke directly to their own struggles against colonial oppression and racial discrimination. In Ethiopia, one of the oldest Christian nations in Africa, the image of Jesus has been depicted for centuries in a way that reflects the country's cultural identity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which traces its origins to the 4th century, has a long tradition of portraying Jesus with features typical of the Horn of Africa. These depictions emphasize that Jesus is not a distant foreign figure, but one who belongs to the local people. The Ethiopian Christians did not view the divine as being separate from their own image. Instead, they saw Jesus as a powerful figure who was both part of their world and capable of transcending it. In the wider African diaspora, especially among African Americans, the question of Jesus' race became central during the civil rights movement. During this time, African American leaders and scholars began to reimagine Jesus as a black man, not only as an act of empowerment, but also as a theological statement. Many African Americans found it difficult to reconcile the image of a white Jesus with their own experiences of racial oppression and injustice. As they fought for civil rights, equality, and recognition, they sought to reclaim Jesus as one of their own, a figure who had experienced suffering and persecution, but had also fought for justice and liberation. This reimagining of Jesus as black was not just an artistic or theological exercise, it was also a political act. In the face of white supremacy and racism, African Americans began to see themselves in Jesus' image, one of a marginalized and oppressed person who, through his divine power, was able to bring about change. This interpretation of Jesus was an antidote to the centuries of racialized images of divinity that had been used to perpetuate white dominance. In many ways, it was about affirming the worth and dignity of black people by showing that Jesus could be understood, embraced, and revered in a way that reflected their own experiences. In the African context, the message of Jesus as a liberator also resonated deeply. For many African Christians, the connection between Jesus and the struggles for freedom was unmistakable. Whether it was the liberation from sin or the liberation from colonial rule, Jesus became a symbol of hope for those in need of deliverance. The suffering of Jesus on the cross, his rejection by society, and his eventual triumph were seen as parallels to the struggles of African peoples who had been oppressed, enslaved, and colonized. Jesus' victory over death and sin offered a vision of redemption and freedom, not just in the spiritual sense, but also in the political and social realms. As African Christians and theologians began to reframe the image of Jesus, they also drew from the African tradition of syncretism, the blending of indigenous beliefs with Christianity. This practice had long existed in African religious practices, where the introduction of Christianity was not seen as the complete replacement of indigenous beliefs, but rather as a way to incorporate new ideas into existing frameworks. By reconceptualizing Jesus as a figure who was not bound to a specific race, African Christians were able to better connect his message to their own cultural and spiritual needs. In modern-day Africa, the debate over the color and race of Jesus continues to be a topic of importance. The question of whether Jesus was black, white, or something else entirely is not just about his physical appearance, but about the implications of his identity for African Christians. For many, the issue of race in relation to Jesus reflects broader concerns about power, identity, and representation within the church and society. As the global church continues to evolve, many African Christians have embraced the idea that Jesus belongs to everyone and that his message transcends the limitations imposed by race. The rise of African Christianity has brought with it a wave of artistic and theological reinterpretations of Jesus' image. Many African artists now depict Jesus with African features, such as dark skin, coiled hair, and prominent facial features. These depictions are not just artistic expressions, but also reflections of the cultural and social realities of African Christians. By portraying Jesus as an African figure, these artists are making a powerful statement about the inclusivity of Jesus' message and the universality of his love and sacrifice. In many African communities, the interpretation of Jesus as a black man is also linked to a broader movement of decolonization and the reclaiming of African identities. For decades, African nations were subjected to colonial rule, during which European powers sought to impose their values, beliefs, and images of divinity onto African peoples. As Africa continues to assert its independence and cultural identity, the reimagining of Jesus is part of a larger movement to reclaim African heritage and dignity. In this context, the depiction of Jesus as black is seen as an act of liberation, as it challenges the long-standing associations of whiteness with divinity and power. One of the most powerful symbols of this African reinterpretation of Jesus can be seen in the way African Christians have embraced liberation theology. Liberation theology, which emerged in the 20th century, focuses on the liberation of oppressed peoples, particularly the poor and marginalized, and has had a profound impact on African Christianity. The core tenet of liberation theology is that God is on the side of the oppressed, and that the church must work to bring about social justice and liberation. In this framework, Jesus is not simply a passive figure, but an active participant in the struggle for freedom. He is seen as a liberator who stands with the oppressed, offering hope and strength in the face of adversity. The rise of African theology has also brought forth new interpretations of the Bible. African theologians have sought to understand the scriptures in ways that reflect their own experiences and cultural backgrounds. This has led to a greater emphasis on the African context in biblical interpretation, where the teachings of Jesus are seen through the lens of African traditions, values, and struggles. The result is a Christianity that is both deeply rooted in African culture and firmly connected to the universal message of Christ. As African Christianity continues to grow and evolve, the question of Jesus' race will likely remain an important issue. For many African Christians, the image of Jesus is not just about his color, but about his message of hope, justice, and liberation. The struggle for a more inclusive and authentic portrayal of Jesus is ongoing, but it is also a testament to the resilience and creativity of African Christians who continue to reshape their faith in ways that reflect their own identities and experiences. In this way, Jesus' race is not just a theological or historical question, but a deeply personal and cultural one that speaks to the heart of the African Christian experience. Ultimately, the color of Jesus is a reflection of the many ways in which he has been understood, revered, and embraced by diverse communities around the world. While the historical Jesus was a Middle Eastern man, the African belief in him transcends physical characteristics. Jesus belongs to everyone, and his message is for all people, regardless of race or ethnicity. The African reinterpretation of Jesus' image is not about erasing history, but about ensuring that his story is accessible, relatable, and empowering to people from all walks of life. Through this reimagining, African Christians affirm their place in the global Christian community and continue to find strength and inspiration in the life and teachings of Jesus.